First, as they say, the news. The news is that Max Verstappen has got a 5-place grid penalty for the Brazilian Grand Prix. Not for the sprint race. We had qualifying for the sprint on Friday, but he has that 5-place grid penalty because they've had to fit yet another new internal combustion engine into the back of the Red Bull, another new Honda ICE. As I've been saying in various live streams and videos over the last couple of months, reliability could yet play a major role in the outcome of the World Championship. We don't see any issues at all with the Mercedes power unit in the back of the McLarens, touch wood, but we have had issues with Max losing power in the race, and as we see here in Brazil, a change of internal combustion engine. So he starts the Grand Prix with a 5-place grid penalty, which is bad news. At the moment, the forecast for Sunday is dry. It was wet, but it looks like it's going to be dry now on Sunday. But the forecast for Saturday for the sprint race is for thunderstorms, scattered thunderstorms. No predicting exactly when they're going to happen in Brazil, of course. So compounding all the issues that Red Bull and Max Verstappen have now against the rise of McLaren, Mercedes, and of course Lando Norris growing increasingly nearer in the Drivers' World Championship, and McLaren looking ever stronger in the Constructors' Championship. So that out of the way. The other news was that Kevin Magnussen who's so good around Brazil and coming off a great race, of course, in Mexico, developed an illness before practice today, before sprint qualifying, and his place for the weekend has been taken by that ultimate stand-in racer, Oliver Baumann, who of course replaced Carlos Sainz at the beginning of the year and finished 7th. Very, very good drive in Saudi Arabia. And now it is Kevin Magnussen being replaced by the driver who has his seat, of course, for 2025, and that is Oliver Baumann. And what a great job he did too, getting through into Q3 ahead of Nico Hülkenberg, who's also no slouch, of course, around Interlagos. Anyway, the other big news, I guess, is that Oscar Piastri has taken the pole for the sprint race. I say I guess because I think at this stage of the year it's almost inconceivable to think that McLaren could yet again shoot themselves in the foot, and if Oscar is in front of Lando tomorrow and they're kind of ahead of everybody else, that they're not going to give the win and maximum points to Lando at this stage of the season. I think that will probably happen. But it was interesting how Oscar did indeed get the pole for the sprint race, because he alone did 2 laps on the soft tyres in Q3. They were out in mediums, of course, in SQ1, SQ2, the first 2 sessions, and then onto the soft tyre for SQ3. And Oscar did the right thing. He went out on a scrub set of softs and did a time that would have been good enough, as it turned out, for about P5 on the grid. Came in for a new set literally with 1 or 2 minutes to go, went out, and that's how he got the pole, eclipsing the time that Lando had done on a new set out of the pits as SQ3 began. Lando, of course, was then on a scrub set and tried hard in the first 2 sectors, but when he saw that Oscar had gone that much quicker, he backed out of the second sector and pulled into the pits to give the pole to his teammate Oscar Piastri. Very, very good planning on this occasion by Oscar. Kind of surprising in a way that Lando didn't do the same thing. They had those 2 different strategies at McLaren, but then the weather was ominous as well. And you could argue, I think, McLaren probably did the right thing. They split their options. They got Lando, the most important driver at this stage of the year, out to get his time in the bag on that new set of softs, which meant he was going to be on scrub tyres at the end. Whereas Oscar, they took the gamble. Maybe it wasn't going to rain. They put him out on the scrub tyres and then new set right at the end when the track was slightly quicker. The other drivers, for their part, the 2 Ferrari drivers and Max Verstappen, the main contenders, of course, and I don't really include, sadly, Mercedes in that now. Lewis Hamilton didn't even get out of Q2, and George Russell was 2 or 3 tenths away from Max Verstappen's Red Bull times. So let's just talk about the 2 Ferraris and the Red Bull. All 3 of them left it really, really late. We're talking literally 2 minutes to go before they left the garage on that 1 set of new softs. So they hadn't gone out and done a scrub lap as Oscar had. And I think that was, again, a mistake on their part, if only because it's switching from mediums to softs. It's quite a big shock. And from Oscar's point of view, it worked really well to go from the medium to scrub softs and then onto a new set of softs. And that really bedded him in for the lap, set him up for the lap. Whereas the 2 Ferrari drivers and Max were going out on that new set of softs, blind if you like, and it was a difficult job for them. Charles Leclerc he got the better lap in, just ahead of Max, just ahead of Carlos Sainz, but it was incredibly close, and the lap passes very, very quickly in Brazil. And what I've done here to try and get a better feel for what happened in SQ3 on the soft tyre, I've averaged out the results of the top 6 drivers as they finished in each sector. Bear in mind, sector 1 is all about top speed, high speed braking into turn 1, down through the center S's, down the back straight into turn 4, very, very hard braking into turn 4, but a long corner that requires really good balance. And Max, for example, complaining that he didn't have great turn in initially with the front flap they'd taken out of the car. And then sector 2 is all about slow speed turn in and traction, lots of switchback hairpins up and down the hill. And then sector 3 is a combination of medium high speed, traction, and also top speed, long straight there, and a long uphill plug as well for the power unit coming out of that last corner, that last hairpin. So although Oscar Piastri got the pole, you can see how good and how quick Lando Norris has been all day on the medium tyre and the soft tyre, and in terms of top speed. He's just got this circuit, McLaren and Lando together got this circuit completely sussed, and they are by far and away the quickest combination around there. Something I said would probably happen in the dry when we were talking about that a couple of days ago with Cameron, and it's difficult to see how Lando wouldn't have been super quick around Brazil. If it's wet, different story, of course. Lando probably still will be very good, but in the dry, 1.67. If you average out his 3 results, he was first in sector 1, second in sector 2, and second in sector 3. So an incredibly good average for Lando for that 1.67. Oscar Piastri second to Lando in sector 1. First in sector 2 on the really good tight stuff, which is where you would expect the new set of soft tyres to be so good right at the end. But only P4 in sector 3, possibly overheating the tyres a little bit in sector 3. Not much difference in top speed, but nonetheless a very, very solid P2 if you take the averages. What a great performance by McLaren and Mercedes today. Absolutely outstanding. Charles Leclerc, 3.7, a little bit away from McLaren's, but you could say appreciably ahead of Max and Carlos Sainz. He was 7th only in sector 1, but then really good in sectors 2 and 3. Sector 2, he was 3rd, just behind the McLarens, and he was actually quickest in sector 3. So very good performance from Charles Leclerc. The only thing that really caught him out there was sector 1, and maybe he didn't get the tyres up to temperature at exactly the right moment. It was very difficult, the warm-up here with the Pirellis in Brazil. This is the softest in the range of the Pirellis. But to get that soft tyre to work for one lap was really, really difficult. Max Verstappen only 5.7, and that gives you an idea. This snapshot as we go into this last phase of the season, only 4 races to go now if you include Brazil. Max 5.7 compared with Lando Norris 1.67. And look at Max's results. 3rd in sector 1, only 5th in sector 2, and only 9th in sector 3. And it was all really, really close. But that reflects also that the Red Bull isn't as quick as the McLaren in a straight line. We're talking 2 or 3 kilometres. And for sure, it doesn't have as good a slow speed turn-in or traction. Probably about there in terms of medium speed corners. But Red Bull still struggling to take the pace, take the race to McLaren. And McLaren here with yet more upgrades, running a new beam wing on the car just to tune the car in terms of the downforce, the specific downforce of Interlagos, some sort of medium range downforce that they have. And what a great job they're doing in the aero department at McLaren in that sense. Carlos Sainz 5.7, exactly the same as Max Verstappen, which you could say is quite good from Red Bull's point of view, I suppose, splitting the Ferraris, but equally for Max to be doing the same sort of average sector times as Carlos Sainz tells its own story, that the Red Bull is far and away from where we've seen it in the past. Carlos 5th fastest in sector 1, 4th fastest in sector 2, and only 8th quickest in sector 3. And remember, Charles was fastest of all in sector 3, so that's where Carlos lost all his time. And then finally George Russell, who was 4th in sector 1, 7th in sector 2 and 7th in sector 3. So Mercedes really struggling, and that showed with Lewis Hamilton sliding all over the place on medium speed corners, locking up, just generally looking very uncomfortable with the car. A lot of talk about getting the tyre temperatures right, how to do the warm-up, but Lewis never ever sadly got it together in that sense. Just quickly looking at the other times after George. P7 Pierre Gasly, another excellent performance in the Alpine Renault, consistently quick. Let's hope he has a decent race for a change. And then Liam Lawson, also excellent in the B-Carb Honda. Interesting how his sheer pace is really starting to unsettle Yuki Tsunoda, who didn't get out of Q2. Alexander Albon, P9 for Williams Mercedes. Another good performance from him. And Oliver Bowman, outstanding again in the Haas Ferrari to be driven, as I say, by Kevin Magnussen, who was fine in the debrief on Thursday, but then got a stomach bug last night and really felt dehydrated and lost all his energy. So, yeah, get well soon, Kev. You would have gone well today, for sure. Lewis Hamilton will start 11th for the sprint race. Disappointing day for him yet again. The cars, as I say, just sliding all over the place. Nico Hulkenberg 12th. Sergio Perez, another disappointing day for Sergio Perez. One wonders how much longer this whole Red Bull Sergio Perez saga is going to drag on. Franco Colapinto 14 for Williams Mercedes. And Valtteri Bottas did well to get into Q2, knocking out Fernando Alonso and Esteban Ocon in the process. And just to go back to Alex Albon, and he just got into Q3. He was in the garage when the checkered flag was out, and he got bumped down to 10th place. So he was very, very fortunate to get through into Q3. And finally, let's just have a look at the speed trap for sprint qualifying. Lewis Hamilton 329. I guess he would have liked to have sacrificed a bit of that top speed to have a bit more grip in the warm-up phase for his car. Lando Norris, that tells its own story, doesn't it? Also 329. I've had to actually put a dot and leave some of the drivers out before we get down to Ferrari at 325. You can see there the job McLaren have done to have that amount of grip and that amount of top speed. 4 kilometers an hour, big difference between McLaren and Ferrari. So there we are, sprint race, as I say. Max has no penalty for that, so he'll be lining up in P4. He really needed to compensate for that penalty by being on the pole, so this is not a good start to the weekend for him, and it could indeed get worse as the weekend progresses, because even if he's really quick tomorrow in qualifying for the Grand Prix, that puts him, P6 on the grid. He's probably going to be P7, P8 realistically, and that puts him right in the middle, dare I say it, of the proximity of the first corner shunt, and we've seen quite a few of those in Interlagos. It's a very, very difficult bit of road to get through without hitting someone or being hit by somebody, and Lando probably will be miles up in the front in free air, and this already, as I say, does not look like a good weekend at all for Max and Red Bull. But anything can happen, of course, and tomorrow it could be wet. As I say, the forecast for Sunday still dry, but it was wet, and it could be wet again, who knows. I'd just like to finish by expressing my sympathy and thoughts for all those affected by, and of course the families who are bereaved in the floods we've had here in Spain, in Valencia. Just unbelievable. There was going to be a Formula E test at Valencia next week. Of course, that's now been cancelled. It's been moved to Jarama in Madrid. And where we are, we're very fortunate. It was very isolated, but our hearts and prayers go out to all those affected by those terrible floods. So there we are. Big thanks to Jetcraft, to OEM Exclusive, and to Track Ninja. Big thanks to you too. See you tomorrow. Don't want to give McLaren pit wall too hard a time, because to their credit, they've produced, semi-produced, an unbelievably good Formula One car in the back end of the 2024 season. I say the pit wall because there's a lot of management there that are in charge of the technical department in effect. So all credit there. All credit too to both the drivers at McLaren, Lando Norris, Oscar Piastri. None of this is their fault. Oscar on the pole for the sprint race, Lando next to him. As I said yesterday, almost a certainty that McLaren finally were going to decide that if Oscar was leading on track, they would have to give the win to Lando Norris. There's only 1 point in it in a sprint race, doing about 8 points for a win, 7 points for a P2. Nothing like the difference in a Grand Prix if you go back to Hungary, and the obvious point there that Lando should have been given the win in Hungary, and the 7 points he effectively lost by finishing second there. He would effectively get 1 point back if he won the sprint race. The problem with the sprint race, of course, is it is by definition short and sweet, and most likely there was never going to be enough margin over whoever was in P3 for the two drivers to be able to change positions whenever the team deemed it to be a perfect moment. And I can imagine before the race, because that's how it turned out, that if Oscar was in front, there was lots of talk about the sort of peloton effect in the Tour de France of trying to use Oscar's DRS to help Lando pull away from Charles Leclerc, massively overcomplicating a problem that was going to, as I say, a short and sweet race. All you can do is look in that situation at two key points. And I say this not after the event. This is what I was saying during the event. The first point is you reverse positions as soon as you possibly can, because in a short race like this, a little bit like Q1 in Baku, when it was obvious there was going to be some issue on the track right at the end, whether it be traffic or a yellow flag from Esteban Ocon, he sent both cars out that late, one of them's going to get a yellow. A little bit like that In a sprint race, you cannot say that there will be no virtual safety cars, no red flag, no yellows, whatever. You have to prepare for that. And if it hasn't happened by mid-race, probably it's going to happen towards the end. That is the nature of a sprint race. And the second golden rule, in my opinion, is that you don't want the guy who's running second, your potential winner, to be spending too long in P2, because it has a detrimental effect on tyres, overheating, debris, all sorts of other things that can happen in the course of a race. So there's every reason to want to do the pass as soon as possible and get on with it in a sprint race. If it's a marathon, if it's a long Grand Prix, completely different story. But this isn't. This was a sprint race. And that doesn't mean relying on things like DRS to get a gap. This means looking at the traffic situation behind you and the risk, if one of your two cars has to slow down slightly, of jeopardizing that position. And it wasn't difficult to read what was going on behind the two McLarens in this sprint race. We had Charles Leclerc, who quite clearly from about lap 3 was holding up Max Verstappen, whose Red Bull looked in much better shape than it had in qualifying. Max all over him, obviously helped by DRS, but his tyres weren't going away, the car was well balanced, and obviously with that fresh engine, he was looking pretty good in terms of power up the hill. So at some point, Max was going to be pushing Charles Leclerc hard. Whether he was going to get past was a moot point, because the reality of McLaren's situation is that Charles Leclerc was going to be spending more time looking in his mirrors than he was at the car in front, which was Lando Norris. And sure enough, on lap 14, with all the four cars having been running around pretty closely together, the two McLarens started to pull away. Charles started to lose a bit of grip. Max was all over him, and suddenly there was a gap. And that was the perfect moment for McLaren to tell Oscar to give the lead to Lando Norris. But they didn't do it. They went into this thing about try to get Lando away, get him in your DRS, get him away, overcomplicating it massively, until towards the end of the race, there was a great risk that they weren't going to be able to do it, because Nico Hülkenberg stopped his Haas Ferrari out on the circuit. Very unusual to see oil smoke these days, something going on with the power unit, oil leak, whatever. Parked the car, very clearly going to be a virtual safety car. And only just before had Oscar slowed down and given the lead to Lando Norris. If Nico had stopped a couple of laps earlier, that would have been it. Oscar Piastri would have won that sprint race and failed to give that extra point to Lando Norris. So as I say, McLaren playing with fire, overcomplicated, I think, in the way they were trying to use Oscar to get Lando away. Lando was sitting there all over Oscar in the early laps saying, what am I going to do? I'm near enough, effectively saying, tell the guy to let me pass now. And McLaren kept saying, hold position, hold position. And at one point, Lando just said, no, whatever. A little bit in the tone of voice, well, exactly the tone of voice, actually, that he used when he was listening to all those instructions. Were they instructions? Pleads, probably, through the radio, through the headset, during the Hungarian Grand Prix. It was the same thing. And racing, as we keep saying, is not complicated. You rely on the fundamental principles. If you're going to reverse position at the front of the race, you're running 1-2, and the race is a short one, and you're never going to have a massive advantage, 8-12 seconds over P3, you've got to look at what the traffic are doing behind and seize the moment immediately as it happens. And that happened lap 14, and McLaren didn't do it. And they played with fire, but they got away with it. They got their extra point for Lando Norris. Max Verstappen did finish third on the road. He beat Charles Leclerc, but then he lost all that with a 5-second penalty imposed after the race for a breach, would you believe, of the virtual safety car regulations. This on the back of two penalties in Mexico. Max needs to get his act together here and not keep shooting himself in the foot. On this occasion, he was 0.63 seconds below the minimum time behind the virtual safety car, effectively within the safety car, when the BSC went green. So that's inexcusable, really. But the bottom line is McLaren played with fire in that race, in my opinion, and they just got away with it. Having said all of that, and I don't want to be too negative about McLaren, because watching those two orange cars going around, and I'm going to call them orange because back in the day, in the days of Can-Am and Formula One in the 60s, when it was Bruce McLaren and Denny Hulme, particularly in the Can-Am, it was orange, but not papyrus. And it looked a little bit like the old Bruce and Denny show, those two orange McLarens pulling away from the field a little bit, well, certainly at the front of the field anyway. Just wonderful to see. And congratulations to the tech team at McLaren for the car they produced, and for that beam wing they've got on the car this weekend, the new one, which obviously seems to be working extremely well too. So yeah, fabulous win by McLaren in that sense. It was a 1-2 domination. Max Verstappen drove well, finished third. Very clean race by Max, apart from that virtual safety car thing. Charles Leclerc fourth. It looked like the Ferrari lost its tyres after about 14 laps. Carlos Sainz fifth, ahead of George Russell sixth. Uninspiring George Russell in the Mercedes. Not his fault, but the Mercedes just not up to it. And Pierre Gasly capitalised on a brilliant qualifying performance in the Alpine Renault to finish seventh on the road, beating such runners as Sergio Perez, Liam Lawson, who went very well in the V-Carb, Alexander Albon in the Williams, and guess what? Lewis Hamilton, who finished 11th. I never thought we'd be saying things like that about Lewis in 2024, but there we are. Not a good day for him at all. Oliver Behrman dropped down the field to finish 14th. So a dominant win for McLaren and Mercedes, but it was close. It was close to what they were trying to do for Lando. And the race was run in the dry as well, despite all the thunderstorm signs and the lightning signs coming up over Sao Paulo on this Saturday. It was a dry race. But now, I'm recording this video, we're putting it out, but now, of course, we wait for qualifying for the Grand Prix. The Max car looks to be a lot quicker now, but the most he's going to do is qualify P6, and more likely it's going to be 7 or 8 given the speed of the McLaren. And as I said yesterday, that's going to be a big problem for him going into the first corner in terms of avoiding the traffic and making sure all his front wing end plates and the back of the car is still in one piece as he comes out of turns 1 and 2. Anyway, there we go. The sprint race, a win for Lando Norris from Oscar Piastri, Max Verstappen, who has incurred a one-place grid penalty. He will start now P4 for the sprint race as a result of that safety car time infringement. Yeah, it was certainly not as easy as the results make it sound. See you soon. Yes, for sure, there's going to be a lot of discussion about this in weeks, months, years, seasons to come. But for me, that probably is Max's best ever win. Now, I know there are lots of chattering voices out there saying, oh yeah, but he didn't just go all the way through the field. He had to have the help from the red flag, and that was a strategy call. It was luck, whatever it was. Plus, he was stuck behind Charles for too long, ready to be right up there with the very best, blah, blah, blah. Well, the first thing I would say is that I don't think that red stop, the free stop, if you like, that he got to go to a new set of intermediates was just luck or even a great strategy call. I think it was Max using the tyres in that first phase of the race better than any other driver on the track. And I say that because of what we could see. What we could see was a recently resurfaced Interlagos, on which it was very difficult in the wet to do any of the normal things. In other words, to go offline, to look for the grip, to do the things that the Maxes and the Lewises and the Charles and probably the Esteban Ocons and the Pierre Gaslys, if we're watching them, do as well. And so therefore, Max had a different problem today in the wet. And the problem was how to be quicker than anybody else. He obviously had a pretty good car. They got the Red Bull RB20 working very well by race day. It was working pretty well for the sprint too, but that was another day. In qualifying, he was, when he was out, the fastest guy on the track. But we never saw that in terms of the results this morning, early this morning, because of everything that happened with the red and not getting out of Q2. And I've done a couple of shorts about that, explaining what happened and giving my opinion on that. But just going back to the point, how was Max on a circuit where you can't really go offline because the racing line wasn't becoming increasingly greasy? There wasn't a lot of crud offline. There wasn't a place he could go different from the normal racing line because of this new surface. What we saw today with Max Verstappen, as I've been saying for several years now on this channel, was the perfect manifestation of a driver who likes to get into a rotation point early, get the car rotated at the point of least possible downside, and then get a nice straight exit. And he was just doing that naturally. But because that's what he was doing, he was staying away from all the white lines on entry that the later corner, wider, more open turn-in drivers were habitually catching with the right rear or the left rear, depending on whether it was a left or right-hander. And that's why we saw so many drivers going off today. And drivers that have had a lot of stuff around them recently. Liam Lawson, Franco Colapinto, two good examples. As we predicted, as we said at the time, and as we predicted, back-end drivers who love to get a slightly wider entry, get the power on, use their car control to balance the car. But here in the wet at Interlagos, they couldn't do it. Every time they touched a white line, they lost grip and spun or crashed or did whatever they did. Lance Stroll was another one, amazingly, given the amount of time he spent with Rob Wilson. But Max, for anybody that was there to watch him, and sadly the TV director didn't spend a lot of time on Max once he'd got the lead. But in those closing laps, once he got past Esteban Ocon, I counted 15 fastest laps. Now this wasn't Max just absolutely on the ragged edge. This was Max feeling the grip. The track was obviously getting quicker as the race ran out. This was Max feeling the grip, doing exactly what he'd been doing all race, turning in a little bit earlier than everybody else, just doing it naturally, not because he thought it was the quickest way, it's the way he drives. Staying away from the white line, therefore, on entry, getting into rotation points. Sometimes he'd get a bit too much understeer. That happened actually just before the safety car came out when he was P2 behind Esteban Ocon, and he had a big understeer moment, just aquaplaned. But generally speaking, those situations can be handled because it's mid-corner, the slowest point of the corner, and he's got understeer. Yeah, okay, the car's going to run a bit wide. What he's never doing is stretching the car on entry and getting a rear on a white line. Carlos Sainz was another one that fell victim to that. And the only driver really who I think normally would drive that well too is Lewis Hamilton. And we didn't see that from Lewis today. And I think he was completely shocked by how badly the Mercedes was handling and how bouncy it was and how little grip he has. Fernando Alonso too, to some extent. The same thing. Aston Martin, an absolute disaster of a car. We'll get on to Mercedes. We'll get back to Mercedes in a minute because a lot of kudos obviously has to go to George Russell and the way he drove today. But that was the difference. And when I was absolutely shocked, I have to say, when Lando Norris started saying on the radio, should we box for a new set of inters to get track position? And they said, no, Lando, it's a bit early to do that. Stay out there. I think the McLaren pit wall on this occasion were absolutely right. But Lando kept at them. And I was surprised by that. I was shocked by that because although, of course, he doesn't have Max's early turn-in, and of course he's right on the edge, Lando. Does it really well with very soft inputs. But he's right on the edge of the left or right rear when he's going into corners, and the white line is the one place you don't want to be. I thought that Lando would be, because the car was so good, because the McLaren is so good, I thought that he would make up for that by the McLaren being as good as Max's tyres were, given the way Max was driving the Red Bull, and that he would be the second last or maybe the last guy to stop for intermediates. I couldn't understand. I still don't understand why he wanted to come in for tyres so early, because it wasn't a strategy call. It was just like, we've got to give Lando this pit stop because he really wants it. Maybe it's going to refresh him and revitalise him, because at the moment he isn't going anywhere behind George, just saying that George is quicker in a straight line. The McLaren for sure was a better car. And it was amazing to me. I mean, it wasn't amazing that Lando was stuck behind him. What was amazing was that he kept thinking that going to new intermediates was going to be the solution, because he should have stayed out. For sure his tyres weren't that different from Max Verstappen's, and he should have stayed out. Going to the others that stayed out, Esteban Ocon and Pierre Gasly, no issue there at all. If you're Alpine, you're Ollie Oaks, and you're that far up, track position, you just go for it. Yeah, maybe it's a bit of a gamble, because for sure they would have been a bit harder on their tyres. And that was a strategy call based on track position, and it really paid off for them. And both drivers were superb, absolutely superb, and the team was brilliant as well. So happy for them. Great to see them second and third. But getting back to Max now, what was so great about Max's drive, I thought, is that it's one thing to be starting P17 if you've made a mess of qualifying or done something stupid, and then you've got the adrenaline up and there's a reason to want to side through the field and win the race. But when 5 places of that, well, actually most of the places of that are due to an engine penalty, which has nothing to do with you, and then that ridiculous red flag thing in Q2 when he was the fastest guy on the track, I would imagine it's quite difficult to be motivated to the point of just sidling through the field and doing what he did, perfectly balancing the risk of overtaking anyone, particularly in the wet, with the importance of being super quick and obviously trying to do as well as you possibly can. And to me, I don't know how you quantify these things about greatest races, but for me, probably as good a moment as any in this Grand Prix was when Max Verstappen passed Oscar Piastri into turn 1, because Piastri was never going to be easy. We know that McLaren would have loved him to have held up Max for as long as possible, as indeed Charles Leclerc did subsequently. And we know that Oscar's a tough guy. It's not going to be easy to pass. It's going to be a quick car as well, the McLaren. And yet he took Oscar completely by surprise, coming from way back behind him. No DRS, of course, in the wet. And wasn't it brilliant without DRS? That's another great thing about this Brazilian Grand Prix in general. Came from way behind, straight down into turn 1. You thought, how has he got that grip level going into turn 1 that Oscar Piastri doesn't have in the McLaren? That was the outstanding thing. At mid-corner, what Max was doing. And what was he doing? No brakes, no throttle, Lando style, but doing it from a slightly earlier turn in. That's what made this drive so superb. And you could tell he was going in too quickly, but he came out of the throttle and brakes, let the car settle, and then he's through 1 and 2, and he just loves that. I don't know how many people he passed into 1. Just superb. Well, the other one, of course, was Esteban Ocon at the restart. We don't often see a restart pass like that. We're kind of lulled into thinking, oh, well, the guy who's leading the race is always going to have the advantage because he's the guy that guns it and he always gets a break from whoever's in P2. But you could tell as they came up the hill, there's Max absolutely on Ocon's tail, and Ocon is sort of weaving like this. And at one moment, he sort of weaves within, I don't know, it would have been about 6 or 7 centimeters at the front of Max's car. Max doesn't back away at all. He just lets Ocon come right there, knowing that the restart's mere seconds away, and he moves across with Ocon. And as he can sense Ocon's just going to floor the throttle, so Max does it at exactly the same time. It was absolutely beautiful to watch. You very rarely see that. Daniel Ricciardo was the last guy I saw doing that, actually. And so they're going down the straight. And is he going to go for it? Yeah, of course he is. Same pass on Oscar Piastri. And again, it was kind of a shock for Ocon, I think, because he'd been going very well, holding position, under a lot of pressure for a lot of the race, and just driving beautifully. But there's Max steaming down the inside. What are you going to do? You've got to give him a bit of room. And not once in any of those moves did Max run wide at all at the rotation point of turn 1. That was the other astonishing thing of how well he judged that moment when he was going to have to come out of the brakes and throttle just before rotation, and he got it perfect every time. Yes, he had that one moment when he was behind Ocon, as I say, when he got the big understeer and went off and lost about 4 seconds. But other than that, I don't actually remember him making a single mistake, because he just drove a Max Verstappen race in conditions on a track surface perfectly showcasing Max's ability and what he can do in a racing car. That's why I think it was probably Max's best win, because we saw him doing what he does at the expense of every other driver on the grid. And I repeat the point, I don't think it was luck that meant that when the red came out, he was still on an old set of intermediates and got a free pit stop. He was on that old set of intermediates because they still felt okay. He had an even wear pattern on the car, on the tyres, because of the way he was managing the dynamic weight. And yeah, keep him out there. From where he was, it was definitely worth the risk to keep going. And it paid off. It paid off absolutely brilliantly. And then when he got the lead, he didn't just sit there 3 seconds in front. As I say, 15 fastest laps. Just pulled away, just driving beautifully. And the other point, I think, is this is probably Max's first proper win of a Grand Prix, without Adrian Newey on the pit wall. I think I'm probably correct in saying that. So this is genuinely the start of a new era, and absolute credit to everybody at Red Bull for keeping their heads down and continuing to operate at the level at which they do, and to build this car, to take that grid penalty. But I mean, when it was announced before the Grand Prix on the Thursday, whatever it was, the Wednesday or Thursday, that Max was going to have to take a 5-place grid penalty because they're fitting a new ICE. Again, the chattering classes all said, oh, well, it's a good choice because it's really easy to overtake it into Lagos. And I'm thinking, really easy to overtake it into Lagos? It isn't that easy. And if you take Max out of the equation, it wasn't that easy to overtake it into Lagos. It was just Max that made it look so good. Yes, you do get the DRS down the straight in the dry. You didn't get any help in the wet, and yet he did all that passing. Absolutely amazing. A brilliant first lap as well. I was preempting the first lap shunt by saying, in a way, if you're running Max Verstappen, you'd rather he was starting from the back of the grid than the middle of the grid in Brazil, because inevitably there's going to be some sort of first corner shunt. Well, there wasn't. And Max, and I think part of the reason for that was because there were 2 big gaps on the grid, because from Alex Albon, who had a massive shunt in qualifying, and Williams again couldn't get the car built. In fairness to Williams, there wasn't a lot of time and it was a massive shunt, so I'm not sure this was a spares thing. I think it was more just the fact that we qualified on the same day that we raced. And Carlos Sainz also started from the pit lane after his all the repairs that had to be made to his car. So there were a few gaps, and I think that made it be, and I think that eased things going into the first corner. And Max took good advantage of that. But how did he do that? It wasn't down the inside. It wasn't doing the usual thing at turn one. It was absolutely going into turn one, not taking any risk on the outside, and then just staying there and giving everybody a bit of room. And as they got to turn two, just basically out accelerating everybody and then passing them all on the outside of three, where many drivers, including, Lance Stroll, I mean, how many times did Lance Stroll go off? What a shame Felipe Drugovich isn't in that car and wasn't in that car for the Brazilian Grand Prix, just in passing. But anyway, Max just passed about 4 cars on the outside of turn 3 before they even got to the straight. Unbelievable. With the tyres still warm, not even fully up to temperature, just that was the moment you thought, yeah, this is going to be a very special afternoon. And when he got to the Leclerc battle, the Leclerc thing with Ocon and Tsunoda, he didn't force the issue. It's very easy in racing, I think, in that situation, whether you're running a Senna, a Mansell, or a Max Verstappen, somebody brilliantly quick in the wet. It's very easy if you've passed a lot of cars early on to keep that going, and then maybe you don't make a mistake, but somebody moves over on you, you go for a hole when maybe you shouldn't do it, a gap. But Max just didn't make that mistake at all. He tried Leclerc a couple of times, knew that it was going to be difficult to pass because Leclerc was quick on the straight, and so he just sat there. And you could just see he knew it was all going to be okay, and this was going to sort itself out. There was still a long way to go. Of course, it was a relatively slow race. And that was another moment that made this a great race for Max Verstappen, because this wasn't Max 2021 with Helmut Marko in his ear telling him that, if they both go off, it's to Max's advantage or whatever. This was Max being a very, very mature racing driver and sitting behind Charles and just sizing everything up and waiting for the moment. And of course, the moment was that Charles came in, he went through his tyres, and Charles came in for new tyres, and Bob's your uncle. He's straight up there. And that was a huge turning point for him as well. But he was behind Charles for at least 6-7 laps. And that required a lot of discipline, as much discipline as it does to not be too quick at the minimum speed point of these corners that Max is straight lining, if you like, and how well he did that. Just a race of absolute patience. So yeah, they were the key moments, and that was why I ranked this win right up there with anything he's ever done. And to some extent, some of the best races I've ever seen. I thought it was just superb. George Russell, he took the lead from the start, from Lando, down the inside, and then Lando backed away a little bit, and then was right behind George for a long time and just couldn't get past with the straight line speed. And I suppose because he felt it was an impasse and he couldn't pass him, I suppose that's why he thought, oh, well, we're going to have to make a pit stop at some point. So let's try and use that to our advantage and do an undercut. But I think that was the wrong approach. It was better to think, we've got a better car here. We'll push George into making the stop first, and then we'll go really quickly for a couple of laps and pull out. That would have been the right move, because for sure the McLaren was doing a better job on its tyres than the Mercedes. But Lando lost more places at a restart when he got Charles inside and got spooked by Charles, and then ran wide, got behind Oscar Piastri even. Oscar had to give him the position back. And then he got stuck behind Charles again, and that was the end of his race. And he will think, well, it was a lucky win for Max. We made an unlucky call when we did. I think he should have not come in. And I think in that car he could have got away with it. I don't think Oscar could have got away with it, but I think Lando could have gone away with it. But he certainly should have stayed out for longer than he did, because he's in a McLaren and because he does drive so well. And when you're feeling the grip going a little bit and you've been behind another car, that's when you need the pit wall to be saying to you, if the tyres are going away, just imagine that everybody else's tyres are much worse than yours. Stay with it, Lando. And there was some very odd. I mean, I've got to say McLaren did the right thing in encouraging Lando to stay out for as long as they did in the early phase of the race. But there was some odd stuff, wasn't there, for Lando back into the race when they said to him, Oscar's got a penalty, so we want you to sit and get as close to Leclerc as you possibly can. In other words, try and pass Leclerc. I mean, and there he was, within a second of Leclerc, a 1.2. I mean, what a thing to say to him in the wet. And quite correctly, Lando got back on the radio and said, well, what do you think I'm trying to do? I'm going as quickly as I can. At that stage of the race, I thought that was an extraordinary message to give Lando Norris. And it's kind of in sync with everything else that's been going on this year from the McLaren pit wall. And very, very odd. Charles Leclerc obviously didn't have a great day. I'd say the Ferrari was suffering about as much as the Mercedes was suffering, but because it's a slightly better car, Charles could do more with it. But both Mercedes and Ferrari had a lot of trouble with bouncing, getting the car, getting the ride heights correct to work. But it's quite clear that this is the sweet spot thing we talk about. The McLaren, you can take the ride heights up to get over the bouncing and the bumps, but they still don't lose much downforce. Whereas if the Ferrari and the Mercedes are raised, they lose relatively more downforce. And that's what we saw. Mercedes more than Ferrari, probably. So it was a difficult race for Charles. We didn't really see Charles doing what he can do in a car. It was just keeping it on the island. And he did that okay. He did all right. But Carlos inevitably fell foul of the whole white line, wide turn-in thing that we've been talking about. Lando 6, Yuki Tsunoda 7th in the end, with Oscar getting that penalty. Drove very well early on. Yuki was up in P3. Again, he would say, oh, well, very unlucky we made the pit stop and we got caught out by that. Had we stayed out, we would have been, top 3, or we would have beaten the Alpines. That's probably what he's thinking. And he's kind of right there. I mean, he went really well. He drove very well, whereas Liam Lawson in the other car had a few moments, some big moments with various other drivers, Lewis, and also with Oscar Piastri. But he's a fiery guy. He's a late turn-in driver. Everyone for sure would have seen that today. And we've always said that, very oversteery. Carlos Sainz, great car control, but no Max Verstappen early turn-in stuff from Liam. Lewis Hamilton, we spoke about. Sergio Perez, he spun on the first lap. I mean, talk about embarrassing. Oliver Behrman had some big moments as well. I mean, he's a wide, open, late turn-in driver too. Valtteri did okay, P13. I mean, okay, he should be better than that. The car's just still not there at all, is it? But it's better than the Aston Martins, you can say that. One thing I should finish with probably is the message from Lewis Hamilton at the end of the race. And I wonder how many people have seen this, but they said something like, Lewis, tough day. And he said, that was a disastrous weekend, guys. That's the worst the car has ever been. But thank you for continuing to try. Great job to all the guys in the pit stop. If this is the last time that I get to perform, it's a shame it wasn't great, but great for you. Although it was quite difficult to understand, given that phraseology, I think what Lewis means is that it's the last race, or Brazil was the last race for that specific race crew that was on his car, the pit stop crew and the guys working on the car, guys and girls working on the car. Which I'd have to say I completely forgotten Mercedes do that. It's such an odd thing. I thought so at the time. It was introduced in the Nico Rosberg period, I think, to sort of stop mechanics getting too close to one driver or vice versa. But for me, that's all part of racing. The drivers working with the mechanics, building up that relationship. The mechanics building up the relationship with the car as well, the specific race car. And I was interested. I just rang around a few engineer friends from other teams after this. As I say, I completely forgot Mercedes were doing this. And for example, Ferrari don't do that. They still do the old school system, which I would call a normal system, of just having the same set of mechanics on the car all year. And I think that's the way to go. I'm just surprised that Mercedes are still doing that, actually. But anyway, there you go. Let's have a look now at the Drivers' World Championship, see what's happened there. McLaren going into this weekend, knowing that Max has got a 5-place grid penalty, knowing they've got the best car, they win the sprint race, finish 1-2, and Max wins the Grand Prix from P17. Talk about things changing on Sundays. And so with that win and the fastest lap as well, Max has 393 points. Lando Norris 331. As I say, that could be 365, 370 if all those other points hadn't been wasted around Lando's season. But anyway, it's 331, so it's a 60-point difference now. And then Charles Leclerc back on 307. And I thought it was kind of poignant at the end of the race when McLaren was saying to Oscar Piastri, the Constructors' Championship didn't take much of a dent and was still in good shape. No mention of the Drivers' Championship at all, which is a shame because Lando's driven incredibly well throughout the season. And I was amazed. He said he didn't really enjoy the win in the sprint race. I mean, given everything he's done for the team and given the win he gave to Oscar in Hungary, I would have thought that he at least would have enjoyed Oscar moving over for him in that sprint race. But he said, oh no, I felt really embarrassed about it, or whatever he said. I don't know. Very strange. So there we are. Yeah, I'm sure 99.9% of everyone out there disagrees with me about that free pit stop that Max got with the red. I think he earned that. So I don't think it should be described as a free pit stop. I don't think it should be described even as strategy. I think that was the epitome of the art, what Max was doing with his tyres and how quick he still was at that stage of the race. He would have won the race had there been no red flag. I'm convinced of that. And that set of intermediates should be put in the, I don't know, the Museum of Modern Art or somewhere as a perfectly used set of intermediate Pirelli tyres. The tyres that Max Verstappen used in that first phase of the race, with lots of overtakes and lots of aggression, but nonetheless was still out there pushing hard when the rain was falling hard. Just amazing. And so there we go. That's the end of this first triple header. Then we got one more triple header to go. Vegas, Qatar, and Abu Dhabi. Well, it's been a long season. Everybody knackered. But I was amazed also how the drivers looked when they got out of their cars. Hardly sweating, were they? Amazing. I mean, it were the ones with the sweaty palms and the tension in races like that. They're sitting in the car, relatively cool and calm, kind of. Relative, I think, in italics. So there, brilliant race. Big thanks to Jetcraft, to OEM Exclusive, and to Track Ninja. And of course, to you, the viewer. We'll be doing some live streams, more videos, etc., in the next 10 days or so. Look for that. In the meantime, thanks for watching. See you soon.